Hello and welcome to PT and Nutrition Education's e-learning platform. Today is going to be the last lecture in the lecture series for sports nutrition and preparation for your examination. Specifically, we're going to be talking about energy intake and energy expenditure, how to measure those two things, and also factors which influence intake and expenditure. And also we're going to be talking about metabolism and once again the factors which could affect your metabolic rate. So when we're talking about energy balance, we're talking about calories in versus calories out. So calories in are for what you ingest, and that's from the foods that you eat. And calories out, which is energy expenditure, comes from calories that are used for energy. If we are eating more than we are expending, then the effect of that is going to be a gain in weight. Now, this can be muscle or this can be fat, and this really depends on the macronutrient prescription and the exercise protocol that you undertake. And then on the flip side, we've also got losing weight. So if we are intaking less than we are expending, we are therefore in a calorie deficit, and the effect of that will be there to lose weight. And again, weight is a relative term and can be referred to weight that we lose through fat, or potentially weight that we can lose from muscle mass, for example. And again, this would be down to the nutrient prescription that we put forward to a client when we're taking part in a weight loss effort. Now, when it comes to the terms of gain weight and lose weight, what we have to understand in sports science circles are just some basic definitions. So with regards to gaining weight, this is referred to as a positive energy balance. This being that your energy intake exceeds that of your energy expenditure. Whereas on the lose weight, this is what's referred to as a negative energy balance. So of course, your expenditure exceeds your intake. And then in the middle, we have a neutral energy balance, where of course intake and output are matched. So the first part of the energy balance equation is of course energy intake. So this is the food which we ingest, and this can be measured in kilojoules or kilocalories. Now, how this is actually determined is by what's known as a bomb calorimeter. So as you can see from the diagram there, what happens is food is actually placed into this bomb calorimeter and it is filled with water, and then within that there is a thermometer. Now, based on the heat which is produced from the food, which is then burned through an electrical ignition, determines the amount of calories that that food actually has. And the amount of calories is determined by the amount of heat needed to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 Celsius. Now, when it comes to the amount of calories that exist within our different macronutrients, we can see here that the heat of combustion is different for each macronutrient. So a carbohydrate has 4 calories per 1 gram. A lipid or a fat has 9 kilocalories per 1 gram, and a protein has 4 kilocalories per 1 gram. So this is something that's certainly a useful bit of information whenever we come to calculate calories within specific macronutrient groups. But again, just the takeaway from this is that kilocalories is the unit of measurement in which the energy within our food can be measured, and therefore can also be a method of measuring within our diet plans. However, it's also important for you to understand that it's never 100% that the calories that you think you've ingested are exactly right. And the reason for that, even this bomb calorimeter, which works out the amount of calories within our food, it still differs from food to food. So we might have 2 exact pieces of chicken breast which weigh 100 grams, and their calorie output may differ by 5, 10, 15 calories. So it is impossible to be 100% sure. However, of course, it's always useful if we're going to talk about tracking, which we will do a little bit later. Now, when it comes to actively trying to measure our intake, there are a number of ways in which we can collect that data and maybe try and at least best guess if it's impossible to be 100% sure, as we mentioned, to best guess the amount of calories that we're ingesting and therefore any appropriate action that needs to be taken in light of that. So we're just going to identify a few techniques for measuring the food that you intake for yourself or for your client or for your athlete, whoever it may be. And they're categorized into two major types. So we've got the current dietary intake, so that's what somebody is currently ingesting through food records. We've got weighed diet records, so anyone that has access to some scales and is literally measuring every single bit of food, then of course that's going to increase the probability that the intake that you're recording is going to be reliable. Estimated diet records, so people that have been practicing food intake and recording their food intake over the course of a period of years or even decades, like some bodybuilders do. They can look at food and eyeball it and then, kind of do a best guess as to the amount of calories that exist within their diet on a day-to-day. It's certainly not as stringent as weighed diet records, but somebody with a lot of experience who knows exactly how to get themselves in shape, whether it to be increase their muscle mass or decrease their body fat, certainly can eyeball foods and make a best guess as to the amount of calories that they're ingesting. When it comes to past dietary intakes, of course, there are a few ways that we can look at a client and their eating habits. We can get them to do a 24-hour recall. We can get them to do diet history, so the types of foods that they regularly ingest, whether they be positive or negative in terms of their health and in terms of their performance, is down for you to decide. And then of course food frequency questionnaire, so a questionnaire which determines their eating patterns, when they eat, how much they eat, which of course can give you an idea prior to working with somebody, the type of foods that they're ingesting, what needs to be changed, what can be kept the same, because not forgetting as well that when working with individuals, whether they be athletes, whether they be recreational athletes such as your clients, it's important to remember that they are human. So people do make mistakes, and people don't necessarily eat the way that they should all of the time. So these are just things that you should consider when we're looking into past dietary intakes. People aren't robots, and it's certainly something that you can take with a pinch of salt and then put your intervention forward once you've collated this kind of information. When it comes to 24-hour recall and diet history, one thing also to keep in mind is that when you're trying to determine the type of diet that your client has been on, the type of foods that they've been eating to get them into the shape that they're currently in, whether that's good or bad, of course it's important to remember that when people are asked these kind of questions, more often than not they may tell a little white lie. People do lie to make themselves look a little bit better. So it is important that you understand that, and then you can put your intervention forward once you have all the information that you need. Now, one of the most popular methods by which your calorie intake can be tracked is an app that you may have heard of before, and certainly one that I advocate and use myself for my own calorie tracking and also for working with my athletes, and that's MyFitnessPal. So you can simply download this onto your iPhone, onto your iPad or into your Android, and you have a range of foods in which to choose from. In fact, most of the foods that you ingest in the UK are now available on MyFitnessPal, and therefore you can simply just search that food, put that into your daily food intake, and then at the end of that day it will then give you a full calorie breakdown, so the macronutrients that you ingested from carbohydrate, fat and protein, of course the amount of calories totaled for that particular day or indeed week, and also if you were interested, it also can give you a breakdown of the micronutrients that you've ingested. So if you have somebody that has a deficiency, for example, from any blood work that they might have got, then you can determine, for example, the amount of sodium, magnesium, potassium that they've ingested from the foods that they've eaten. Now, of course, the opposite to energy intake is energy expenditure. Now, when you think about energy expenditure, the go-to thought process may point towards exercise, and you're absolutely right, exercise is a part of energy expenditure and certainly can create a huge surplus or deficit depending on how much or how little that you do. However, it's only one of four components regarding energy expenditure, and we're just going to explore these individual components of energy expenditure now. So, as we've already mentioned, energy intake is the food which we're ingesting, the kilocalories that we're ingesting. But when it comes to energy expenditure, as mentioned, we're talking about four different types. Now, the first one, which you may have heard of before, is your resting metabolic rate. So this accounts for 60 to 75% of your total daily output. So it's influenced by many different things, and this is why there can be a differential between certain individuals, and it's determined by muscle mass, age, gender, genetics. There are a few things which your resting metabolic rate, the amount of calories that we're burning through simply keeping your body functioning, keeping it alive, and it's determined by these factors. So for example, people with higher amounts of muscle mass have a higher resting metabolic rate because muscle is demanding of calories in order to maintain its size and its function. So anyone that has a larger muscle mass will have a larger resting metabolic rate. When it comes to age, somebody that is, for example, going through puberty or is certainly a younger individual, they're going to have a higher resting metabolic rate because the body has still not fully developed and therefore requires energy and therefore calories in order to gain that full development. However, as we age and we get past the age of 25, our resting metabolic rate begins to decrease. When it comes to gender, one of the reasons why men, as a general rule, have a higher resting metabolic rate than women is down to muscle mass. So it is well documented that on an average scale, that males have a higher muscle mass percentage than females, and this may therefore account for why a male's resting metabolic rate is actually higher than a female's. And then of course we've got genetics. We've simply got the genetics of your mother and father, which play a part in your resting metabolic rate. So the likelihood, for example, of somebody being obese is increased if their mum and dad were also within that category. And the same goes for somebody that's got a inclination for higher muscle mass. Then the likelihood is that your resting metabolic rate will be higher, and you will also have a predisposition for increased muscle mass, the ability to gain it through training. So again, genetics does play a huge part in that. The second one that I want to draw your attention towards is something known as dietary thermogenesis. So this is the energy which is actually used in order to break down, to transport, and to use your food that you've ingested. Now, when it comes to different macronutrients, for example protein, this has a higher dietary thermogenesis simply because it's a lot harder for the body to digest and to therefore use it. So actually eating protein creates it more of a thermic effect of feeding, and therefore can potentially increase your energy expenditure. Adaptive thermogenesis, this is where the environment which can change, hence the word adaptive. So for example, being in a low temperature environment could potentially increase our resting metabolic rate. through, for example, shivering to increase your body's temperature. Even though that body's attempt to increase your body temperature by shivering is actually futile, it can still increase our resting metabolic rate, but certainly not by any significant amount. Stress, somebody that's in a heightened environment of stress can therefore burn more calories and therefore increase their resting metabolic rate, simply because there's a release of catecholamines or noradrenaline from being in a constantly stressed state, which can therefore increase our resting metabolic rate. And then of course we've got our physical activity. So through exercise, and of course there are the variables, the fit principle of exercise, where we can do different intensities which may have a different impact on the expenditure. How long we exercise for, of course, the longer we exercise for, the more calories that we're going to burn. How often we train per week, which is frequency, of course, is going to have an impact on the total energy expenditure throughout a week. And then of course the type of training, so it could be low intensity steady state exercise, or it could be high intensity interval training, which all have a different impact on calorie burn during a certain session. So it is important to know the 4 ways in which your body can expend energy, and it's important to know these. This could potentially come up in your examination. Now this is just a diagram which really explains everything that we've just talked about in the previous slide. As you can see, energy expenditure is sporadic throughout the day, and of course that's dependent upon the type of activity that you're doing at particular times throughout the day. The thermic effect of feeding, as you can see, just through digesting food and supplying it to the muscles or the fat cells, that in itself costs calories. Arousal, so through increase in the adrenaline and noradrenaline, catecholamines, you can raise heart rate and therefore increase the amount of calories which are being burnt. Your resting energy expenditure, so that's just the amount of calories that it costs your body in order just to keep you functioning and keep you alive. That's your heart beating, your brain functioning, your lungs inhaling, exhaling, and so on. And then we have sleeping metabolic rate. So of course when you're sleeping, you are going through the processes of growth and repair, memories being consolidated, so many different things, and that's going to be of a calorific cost to the body. Now when it comes to objectively measuring energy expenditure, there are 2 ways which we can go about this, and there is something what's known as direct calorimetry, and we also have indirect calorimetry. Now when we're talking about energy expenditure in a sports lab, for example, with high-end expensive equipment, then we can start to get a little bit closer to the amount of expenditure that takes place for different exercise activities. Direct calorimetry is probably the most reliable that we have in terms of measuring expenditure, and as you can see from the diagram, it involves somebody going into a controlled environment, okay, and exercising for a period of time. Now we have 2 things which are being measured whilst this person exercises. The first one is the heat which is being produced. Of course, that is a byproduct of the energy which is being used by the body, and this would be able to determine how much heat is being expelled and therefore how many calories are being burned. But alongside that, there is also the amount of CO2 which is being produced by the subject, which again would determine the amount of calories which are being burned. Those 2 data points together probably give us the most reliable energy expenditure total that we have currently in our availability. However, of course, one of the huge disadvantages to this is that we can't have people, especially in team sports or field sports, conduct this kind of energy expenditure protocol, simply because we don't have a football pitch where we can control the environment and control heat and control the CO2 that's being produced from individuals. So whilst this is quite useful for certain substrate that is being used, so the fuel that is being used during exercise, and also the amount of calories which are being burned during stationary bike work, it's not applicable across the whole field of sports science. And the other way to measure expenditure is what's known as indirect calorimetry. Now, this is a little bit less invasive. It doesn't require individuals to be in a controlled environment. It doesn't involve people being on metabolic wards like some studies have done in the past, where people have literally lived in a certain environment for 24, 48 and even up to a week to determine the amount of energy that's expended. Indirect calorimetry may be more relevant to what you've seen before. So as you can see from the pictures here, we have an old VO2 max test going on here with a Douglas bag. We've got somebody with a backpack who is actually playing golf, and therefore the gases that are being exchanged are being tested. And then this is probably a little bit more similar to how it's developed in recent years in sports laboratories, and that's a respiratory exchange ratio reader. So what's happening there is the amount of oxygen that this person's breathing in and the CO2 that's being breathed out is being measured by this machine, and then they're doing a fancy equation to determine not only the amount of calories that are being burned, but also the substrate that's being used. So just to talk a little bit more about that, when you're breathing in a certain amount of oxygen and producing a certain amount of CO2, what's happening there is that you're going through what's known as your respiratory exchange ratio. So the volume of CO2 divided by the volume of oxygen gives a certain figure, and that certain figure lets you know the amount of calories that are being burned and whether you're predominantly burning fat or whether you're predominantly burning carbohydrate. Now, approximately 5 calories is expended for every 1 litre of oxygen consumed. However, if we're using fat as fuel, then that is more like 4 calories. And if we're using carbohydrate as fuel, then that's likely going to be around the 5 calorie mark. Now, of course, we have a sliding scale, and we can be between these two facts, and we can be burning fat at 50% and carbohydrate at 50%, and it would be somewhere around the middle. But what that actually tells us is that in order to use fat as a fuel, you've actually got to consume more oxygen, and therefore your body has to work harder. So you might not necessarily be as efficient when burning fat as a fuel in terms of energy production, and as well in relation to how quickly that energy is being produced. And that's something that's certainly been looked at in recent literature, looking at substrate utilization for different physical activity. Now, when indirect calorimetry became more accessible for sports scientists across the globe, a lot of data was gathered from a plethora of individuals and subjects. And as mentioned before in the carbohydrate and fat lectures, the type of substrate that we burn is also dependent on the intensity of the exercise. So as you can see from Luc van Loon, who took a lot of data from a lot of different participants, and it showed that when we're working at lower exercise intensities, then we're burning more fat for fuel as opposed to carbohydrate. And when we're working at more higher exercise intensities, so this was 75% of the wattage that was cycled on a stationary bike, then we can see that carbohydrate and plasma glucose, so that's glucose that is circling the blood, is being used for fuel. So really this just backs up what we've already mentioned in previous lectures about the type of fuel which is being utilized. And to circle back to indirect calorimetry, from the amount of fuel that's being used from carbohydrate and from fat, and also the duration at which we're working for, then we can determine the amount of calories which have been burnt. So again, this is just ways of determining energy expenditure, but also looking at the substrate which is utilized. And again, as mentioned earlier on in the fat and carbohydrate lectures, the substrate that you utilize during exercise can also be determined by your nutrient status and the diet that you are ingesting, whether that be a high fat diet or a low carb diet, or a high carbohydrate diet and a low fat diet. That would determine also the type of substrate that you're using. Now, when it comes to the energy stores that we have in our body, again, this was mentioned earlier in the carbohydrate lecture. when we're talking about the use of muscle glycogen, so that's also stored carbohydrate, as you're aware, and also if we combine that with liver glycogen, which again is stored carbohydrate in the liver, then we only have around 3,000 calories worth of energy that we can draw upon, provided that we don't ingest any food. Now when we look at adipose tissue, so that's our stored fat, look at the calorie difference in terms of stored energy. 120,000 calories we've got stored in our adipose tissue, and not forgetting that this individual was a lean 70 kilogram male. So even somebody who's quite lean has a mass amount of adipose tissue that they can draw upon. However, to access those fat stores, again, this takes more oxygen and therefore more effort from the body in order to produce that energy. Nonetheless, it may be advantageous that if we can dual fuel and then use our muscle glycogen and our liver glycogen during more high intensity bouts. And of course, that's something that we can implement and utilize with our clients and our athletes in order to bring about a better intervention depending on what that individual wants or needs. Now, whilst this following slide is certainly not going to be on the exam, I thought it would be quite useful to show you, since we are talking about intake and expenditure, how is it if we've not got access to the most scientific equipment that we can actually start to utilize some of these tactics and strategies with our client. And I just wanted to give you an example of something that I've used in the past with my athletes, and this was for a MMA athlete by the name of Mike Grundy. So as you can see, I set out his diet for the week, and of course that is related to his training times and the type of training that he's doing. However, what I wanted to show you was how we tracked the calories and then how we made changes as he progressed throughout the weeks in order for him to make weight. Of course, as an MMA athlete, they have to weigh a certain weight in order to compete. So Mike actually competes in the featherweight division, which is 66 kilos. And if I remember rightly, this is around 8 weeks out. Okay, so as you can see, we've got his meals which are outlaid. You can even see that there are some instances, for example here, where I've just put the word fatty protein. So what I do actually, I provide them with a nutritional choice sheet, and whenever it says fatty protein or vegetables, they can go to the food list which I've provided, and depending on how they feel that day and what they want to eat, they can make their own decision. Now, what I've done is use MyFitnessPal, as mentioned earlier, and like I told you earlier, that gives you a total amount for that day. So on Monday, he would consume 2,436 calories. 271 grams of that was carbohydrate. As you can see, he had an intense wrestling session in the morning, so we needed to make sure that he was well fueled for that. His fat was around 59 grams on that particular day, which was a low fat day, I suppose, and then we were eating around 200 grams of protein. So that was Monday. Now, of course, we don't have to stick to the same amount of calories for every single day, so we did fluctuate, and this is again something that you can employ with your own clients or athletes, because if we have to meet a certain calorie quota at the end of the week, then you can certainly have high calorie days and low calorie days. You can fluctuate depending on the training demands, depending on how that person's feeling. So don't feel that if you're aiming for 2,500 calories for the week, then you have to hit 2,500 calories every single day. As you can see from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, there was a little bit of fluctuation, and in fact on Saturday I think I even allowed up to 3,000 calories. That followed a very intense sparring session. So again, you can play around with the calories. Now, why am I showing you this in relation to energy intake and energy expenditure? Because once I've got a weekly figure for what he's consuming, and you can see here he's consuming 2.6 grams per kilogram of protein, 2.6 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, and 1.2 grams per kilogram of fat. So that's over the course of the week. Now, when it gets to the end of the week, I ask Mike to send me an update of his weight. So from the calories which we've determined for that particular week and the training load which he's undergone for his training camp, he sends me his weight, and then what I do with that information is then I'll go away and I'll make changes to his diet plan as and when needed, depending on the weight which has been received. We weigh in at the same time in the same conditions every week, and then from that I can determine whether to increase certain calorie prescriptions or decrease depending on the information that I've received. So you can see there that that's just simply done from a text conversation or on the occasion where I actually go and visit him and do the weigh-in myself. And then of course when it gets to the end of the camp, we don't do any kind of rapid weight loss. We've week by week we've reduced his weight over the course of 10, 12 and sometimes even 8 weeks depending on the fights that are available. So the aim really is to make sure that Mike makes the weight in the safest way possible, and that's something that I've been particularly interested in for quite a while. So as you can see, other than the end of camp testing, which did have a little bit of expensive equipment involved, there isn't any hocus pocus. There's just simple strategies which you can employ right now with your clients if you're working with any. So hopefully that's been of use to you, and maybe something that you could employ yourself in terms of a weight making effort with an athlete, or even just somebody that's looking to lose fat, gain muscle, whatever it may be. Maybe that's a strategy that you can use in order to determine energy intake, energy expenditure, and therefore energy balance and the weight which you're looking to achieve, or of course the body composition that you're looking to achieve. Now, the following slides certainly won't be in your examination, but again, I feel that I would be remiss if I weren't mentioning some of these points, considering we're on the topic of energy balance, weight gain, weight loss. Now, when it comes to working with a client, it's important to remember about some of the psychosocial influences and effects that diet can actually bring about. Now, of course, we all have our opinions on good food and bad food, and that's certainly portrayed in the media as well. Now, what I want to discuss is the fact that when we consider a good food or a bad food, what is it that we're actually relating that to? Because for me, there is a triad of factors which we need to consider, especially as you being the sports nutritionist working with a client, that you're going to have to consider in order to make sure that you're getting the most out of your client. Now, when we look at a food, for example, pizza, a lot of people will consider that as a bad food for you. Now, yes, it could potentially be bad for you if you're eating pizza 3 times a day, 7 days a week, because of course that's going to put you into a positive energy balance, and the likelihood is that that's going to increase your fat stores, your adipose tissue. However, when we look at a pizza in isolation, whether that be once, twice, even 3 times a week, then we shouldn't consider that as a bad food, because if we are just eating purely for our physical health and we're eating meals like this 3 times a day, 7 days a week, then that can be just as detrimental, not only to our mental health, okay, but also to our social cultural health. Now, there are athletes and there are people that compete that have to go through this kind of process, and they will explain to you that, you know, during that period of time where they're trying to achieve a goal, then their mental health and their social health, their social life will actually be impacted because of that. And that's certainly something that you should consider when you're planning, because for me, you can't separate the physiology of your body from the psychology. The two go hand in hand. Yes, we may have something or may know something which is most beneficial for our physical health, but is that necessarily as beneficial for our mental health or even our social alliances with our friends and our family and so on? So definitely something that you need to consider, that it's not just a one-dimensional focus. You as the personal trainer have to consider the mental health and the social cultural health of your individual, and not just the physical health. So, when we talk about 80-20 diet, for example, where we eat 80% of the food that is good for us, quote unquote, but then 20% we get to enjoy with our friends. We maybe get to eat a pizza, have a glass of wine, whatever it may be. The main message here is that a one-dimensional focus on this triad does have a trade-off, and you need to make sure that you consider that when working with any athlete or client.